Again, that's my title. The title of my presentation today is Cognitive Decline and Dementia Among Older Latinx Adults in the United States, Current Knowledge, Controversies, and Future Directions. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the multiple collaborators that have worked with me on much of the data and results I'm going to present to you today. And before I begin, I'd just like to give a brief outline of my presentation today. Today, I'm going to talk about the U.S. Latinx population, and particularly why it is important to study older Latinos when we're thinking about dementia and cognitive decline. I will also talk briefly about the current knowledge in dementia life expectancies, as well as controversies in dementia ascertainment and population health for population studies. I will then move on to within group heterogeneity, specifically among the older Latinx population. And finally, I will conclude with COVID-19 concerns and implications for future research. While I'm giving this presentation, I would just like the audience to keep in mind while I'm going through these several topics, who is at risk for cognitive decline and dementia? When are they at risk, and why are they at risk for cognitive decline? So I will begin with the demography of Latinos. There is a general view that Latinos in the United States are recent newcomers, and this overlooks the long history of many groups and their incorporation in the United States, from the Mexican origin population in 1848 in the Treaty of Hidalgo, to other groups such as Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and so forth that have migrated at later waves to the United States. However, have had a long presence here in the United States. From here, what we could see is from 1980 to 2020 is that the Latino population has increased tremendously in the size and the number. We know that in 2000, for the 2000 census results, that Latinos surpassed African Americans as the largest minority group in the United States. And the most recent numbers from the 2020 census shows that the Latinx population has surpassed 62 million. And as we know, with the increase, here we see the percentage increase by decade, and the percent of the US population has been steadily increasing over time. More so, recently, with the Latino population growth being the driving engine behind the overall US population growth. Particularly in 2010, we see 2000 to 2010, we see a minimal decline in the growth of the Latino population relative to the US, but they are still the driving factor behind the overall increases in US population growth. One thing to keep in mind when we talk about Latinos, particularly relative to the white population, is that Latinos are relatively young in age structure compared to whites. We could see here per this data that Latinos compose a larger proportion of those aged 0 to 17 and a smaller proportion of those aged 65. What this comes across as we see, what this table also indicates is that the median age is approximately 30 years for Latinos versus approximately 44 years old for whites. So there's approximately a 14-year age difference in age structure before these two populations. Here, I'm going to show to you age 6 pyramids for Latinos and whites based on 2019 data. As we could see, the US Latino population, the age pyramid here, is more of a traditional population pyramid with a youthful population you could see here versus whites, where we see the white population where it is more older compared to whites. This will ultimately lead to an increase in population of older adults, not just for Latinos, but for other groups. Recent projections by the census show that by 2060, Latinos are gonna increase by approximately 2.5 times compared to the proportion in 2016. And during this time, it's important to also keep in mind that the overall proportion of the white population, older white population, will be decreasing with the increases of other minority groups and population aging. One thing I would like to note specifically when we're talking about the Latino population is in the period between 2010 and 2019, we see much of the increases among older age groups, 55 to 64, and these other age categories, 10-year age categories, where the vast majority of population aging is happening among Latinos. And with these increases over time, there's projections where we're going to see a convergence of the younger and the older Latino population. I showed you this figure briefly early on, but in the future, the U.S. Latino population is no longer going to resemble a traditional population pyramid, and they will soon resemble the older white population in regards of population pyramid. Importantly, also, I would like to note that the distribution of the older population, 65 and older in the United States, is not equal across states. As we could see, and most of you would probably recognize that areas with larger proportion, for instance, the Southwest, have large traditional populations, particularly the Mexican origin population in the Southwest. Cubans and Puerto Ricans in Florida, we see a large aging population, as well as here in New York State. But in these new areas, where new destination areas, the population is also increasing. And I just wanted to highlight, again, how the distribution of Latino population has been changing over time. For the first 5 categories, they're largely the same, which we would recognize. But there's increasing new destinations, Georgia, for instance, Colorado, North Carolina, where there are growing populations of Latinos. Another thing I would like to highlight when we talk about demographics of the Latinx population is how the Latinx population chooses to identify. From here, we could see that there is not a consensus, an overall consensus, in how Latino individuals in the United States choose to identify. Even so, with the most recent term Latinx, we could see that there are variations by cohorts in those who choose to use this identity and those who rarely or never use this identity. And also thinking about race and the identity of Latinos, evidence from the most recent census indicates that the number of Latinos identifying as white alone has decreased dramatically, where we also see a small increase in those who choose to identify as white in combination with others. More importantly, in the United States, Latinos share that their skin color shapes their life experience, shapes their lived experiences. And this is very important when we think about discrimination in the United States, particularly in this divisive era. However, race and ethnicity, when we think about racial and ethnic identity among the Latinx population, is very nuanced and very complicated. Here we see a cover from Texas Monthly in which Stark County, 96% of census respondents identified as Latino, and almost 99% identified as white. So this means that this county along the south border of Texas isn't just one of the most one of the largest counties that identify as Latinos, but also one of the largest that identify as white also. And with that being said, it's important to note that Latinx as well as Black individuals see that their origin, their identity is central to who they are, which is less so for the white population. This has led some sociologists, here I have a study by Nancy Lopez, to further investigate these identity issues, specifically what's your street race, where in this study, they ascertained 3 measures of race: street race, or how you believe other Americans perceive you at any level of the street; socially assigned race, or what we call ascribed race; as well as self-perceived race. And very quickly, I just want to go through a couple of these. As we could see, depending on how the respondent chose to identify, there's large variation in how respondents identify their race. And I just want to know that it's important. Context is very important when we talk about identity, particularly in population research and other formal areas where we ask these types of self-reported questions. And to make things even more complicated, here I want to highlight findings from Elizabeth Arias a couple of years ago, where they were looking at risk of mortality by race and ethnicity among Latino groups. And one thing I just wanted to highlight it, despite here we have Latinos who identified as white, Black, some other race, and multiple race. And these are life expectancies at age 25 for females. And as we could see, despite how Latinos, whether they're foreign born or US born, despite how they choose to identify, they have comparable or better, longer longevity than that of the non-Latino white population. Regardless of nativity status or race, even Afro-Latinos have comparable life expectancies to that of whites. And this is important to think about also when we're considering the demographics of the Latino population. Next, I just like to briefly highlight a few SES factors. As we know, Latinos lag behind their white counterparts in high school completion, as well as college completion. And while these disparities have been narrowing over time in each category relative to these US born and foreign born Latinos. As we could see, the foreign born in particular when it comes to education to other groups, particularly by the status. But these are all important factors, particularly for the Mexican origin population, when we talk about the lack of healthcare coverage. And also, one thing that I really want to highlight in regards to education and the Latino population is this rising. Generally, what we see is a pattern where males are more educated than their female counterparts. And again, this has consequences for cognitive functioning across the life course. However, what we're witnessing in more recent cohorts of Latinos is that women are now exhibiting higher education than their male counterparts. And it's not clear how this is going to play out yet in the future, but it is something that we need to keep an eye on. And last, in talking about healthcare coverage, we know that Latinos and as well as African Americans have difficulty with healthcare and finding doctors in particular who share the same background, as well as there's a perception of unfair treatment in the healthcare system relative to whites. And more importantly, Latinos are more likely to report negative experiences with their providers. One thing I also would like to talk about is resources. When we think about resources, I always think about fundamental cost theory and wealth. And we know relative to other groups, particularly whites, that Latinos lag behind in median household wealth, regardless of educational attainment. There are large disparities, particularly for postgraduates, between Latinos and whites across all educational attainment categories. And when we look at the distribution or the wealth distribution from different percentiles, it doesn't matter. We see these disparities regardless of percentile, with Latinos making relatively pennies on the dollars compared to whites. And more importantly, when we talk about Latinos, we know that they have larger households and that there is a big impact for Latino families who have children, for those married, and even more so for those who are not married, relative to Latinos and others who have no children. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we think about wealth. And as we know, due to segregation and what have you, that academic attainment of Latinos has been severely impacted, particularly under older generations. However, even among Latinos who have parents with both bachelor degrees, they still lag behind almost 10% relative to whites in regards to parental educational attainment and adults' children wealth. So the transformative assets that we see and is not happening also for Latinos. When we talk about cognition also, language is another factor that's a very important indicator and impacts cognition, particularly batteries and assessment among Latinos. And the one thing that I wanted to highlight here is that among US born Latinos, we see more English speaking at home and higher English speaking proficiency and less speaking Spanish at home, which contrasts to the foreign born where the rate of speaking at home has largely been constant over the past 40 years. And we've only witnessed a slight increase in those who speak English proficiency among the foreign born population during this same time. And just thinking about the future, there has been research that has already shown that the undocumented population is projected to increase dramatically in the future. This is something that we also have to keep a close eye on, particularly for those who lack healthcare coverage. And due to all these demographic changes, largely driven by the Latino population, some researchers have argued that more and more with the increase in the age of the Latino population, that the US population is going to reflect more and more the older Latino population. So to summarize very quickly, the US Latino population is rapidly growing and aging. However, there is variation by state in the proportion of older adults across America. And there's mixed evidence and mixed views on how individuals identify both racially. And I would argue, and others argue, that part of this we see decline in Latinos racially identifying as white due to just increases in education, income, and wealth. There are still large disparities that remain relative to whites. And we also, I think, need to keep a better eye on English language and English proficiency, particularly when we I think that's not clear about across studies. And when we think of the impact of bilingualism on cognition, that is an area that definitely needs more exploration. So next, I want to talk about dementia ascertainment and population health. And I'm gonna use data from the HRS, the Health and Retirement Study. And for my outcome, I'm gonna use the Langolier algorithm. And here we just have, this is the 27-point version of the TIGS that includes immediate and delayed recalls, 0-7, counting backwards. And here are the cutoffs for the classifications based on the researchers. And for this analysis, this is so the base life table. I'm not going to go through all of this. This is basic life tables for looking at healthy and unhealthy life expectancy in large populations. Next, I would like to present to you a paper I had published a couple of years ago, and this is cognitive life expectancies at age 50 for normal cognition, cognitive impairment, no dementia, and dementia by race, ethnicity, and gender. And the explanation of this is at age 50, for instance, white females could expect to spend approximately 28 years with normal cognition, 4 years with CIND, and approximately 1.5 years with dementia. And this equates to spending 83% of the remaining years after age 50 in cognitively normal state. Compared, when we look at Latinas, both US born and foreign born, what we see here is that both groups are spending significantly less with normal cognition, significantly more with CIND and dementia. The foreign-born women are particularly disadvantaged, where they're only spending approximately 51% of their remaining years with normal cognitive functioning. And we could see similar patterns for men. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this. Next, I want to talk about some results in a follow-up study using the same data, cognitive life expectancies by race, ethnicity, and nativity status. What I did in this analysis was to explore the cognitive reserve hypothesis. That is, that higher educational attainment would lead to longer cognitive functioning, more cognitive reserve, and longer cognitive functioning over time. What I did, in addition to the previous analyses, was stratify these three groups by educational attainment. Less than high school, those with a high, particularly for Latinos, there are increases in life expectancy, the years cognitively normal, and dementia with the increased educational attainment. However, there are still large disparities between the Latino population and the white population. So while we see that there are improvements with educational attainment, and I would argue that so education here is not the big equalizer. I'm gonna skip through this. And I'd just like to highlight that the US Latinx population is disadvantaged in cognitive life expectancies. They spend more years with CIND and dementia regardless of nativity status, and they spend a larger proportion cognition with education, new knowledge, and ongoing controversies related to dementia ascertainment. And here we have two studies that really motivate the results that I'm about to share with you. When we talk about cognition and differences by race and ethnicity, there is also often how dementia ascertainment uh, is done in these studies arises, particularly with racial and ethnic differences and differences by education among groups. So these two studies, the authors proposed different methods for algorithmic classification of dementia status. And what they did was they proposed six models. They argue that given the lack of large nationally representative samples with informal dementia ascertainment, that the development of dementia prediction algorithms that minimizes differences in predictive performance across groups is crucial for disparity research. And in the studies that I showed, they tested several models and they proposed these three models here. This is a new model. The expert model is the model that they propose to use using traditional methods, and the herd and Lasso models are algorithm methods using machine learning approaches. One thing, and here are results with the HRS. I would like to note that now the cognitive life expectancies are based on dementia and dementia-free. So we are no longer looking at cognitive impairment or normal cognition. The main outcome of interest in, for this slide is dementia. And as we could see, regardless, here's the lingo weir from the previous studies. This is the expert that they proposed, the algorithm that they proposed. But what we could see, particularly in regards to Latino women at age 70, there's not much difference between the lingo weir model and the proposed expert model for dementia life expectancies. We see 0.1 difference here. However, there is somewhat more variability in the herd and the Lasso model, with these models predicting more years, 0.7 years or 0.9 years for Latino women with dementia life expectancy at age 70. Although they did not get into this, one of the things that I explored, they only looked at Latinos as a pan-ethnic group. I stratified these groups. As we know, there are well-known differences by nativity status, and we see that these models, when we look at all Latinos as a pan-ethnic group, regardless of what algorithm method we use, that these models overestimate the dementia life expectancies for US Latinos, and they overestimate for foreign-born and underestimate for US-born, excuse me. So that's something that we need to keep an eye on also moving forward. Nativity status. These algorithms were specific for Latinos, but not Latino subgroups. And this is for males. Again, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip through these. And the differences between algorithms, interesting enough, there was no significant differences between Latino groups. However, there was differences in dementia classification for whites and for African Americans. Here, I don't think I have the time to go to this right now. This was just a sensitivity analysis looking at the groups for the algorithms for the prevalence of dementia here, and also biennial dementia incidence, both at 2 years and 16 years. So summary, little differences between algorithms. Large disparities remain for Latinos as well as African Americans, and further research is needed to explore these algorithms. So very quickly, I'm going to go to within group heterogeneity among older Latinos, and I want to make the argument why we should aim to collect more data so that we could have more robust and conduct more robust studies and analyses on different Latino population subgroups. As we know, and as I mentioned earlier, the Latino population has increased largely. We could see this from Mexico, the Caribbean, and South America among recent cohorts. One thing to consider consider when we think about Latinos and this pan-ethnic group is that this population comes from many countries in Latin America and the country, as well as Spain, that are racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse. And here's just a group of countries to illustrate the previous slide, how diverse and where these countries are. And it's also important to note the diverse history of different groups in the United States, particularly the Mexican population, Mexican origin population, Puerto Rican population, and how Cubans differ compared to these groups in their socioeconomic status and also the receptivity they receive upon migration to the US. Notably, concentrations of these groups are in different parts of the United States, as we well know, although this is slightly changing. And I'm going to explore some of these differences further in the HRS. This is looking at Latino cohorts in the HRS. I personally believe this is the best data set that we have to look at population level data regarding Latinos and cognitive decline and dementia. And one thing which mirrors, I'm going to start with self-reported race in the HRS. This is age 50 and older. What we see also is a decline by cohorts. These are HRS cohorts, a decline in those who identify as Latinos, as white, and an increase as those who identify as other by race. Also, we have seen an uptick, as I showed you, in the percentage of foreign-born population, and a decline in those with less than high school education, although we've also seen an increase by cohort in hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. Population who identifies as Mexican origin was not available at the time. And there are differences in the age distribution of Latinos too. Foreign-born Cubans, as well as these other groups, have a higher proportion of older adults, whereas US-born, the Mexican origin population and US-born Puerto Ricans have a younger proportion of individuals in the United States. And there are also disparities or variation, I should say, within group variation by these groups in educational attainment, in poverty, in health-related behaviors that impact COVID-19 and other health outcomes, as well as those who have healthcare coverage and obesity. But this is just a few things in the HRS. We know for the Latino population that there's a host of other issues that are important that could potentially impact cognitive functioning, and it's important that we keep that in mind. Next, I'm going to transition to COVID very quickly. I know I'm a little short on time here. I just want to document that early on, the Latino population, as we know, particularly older adults, were experiencing high, devastating, and disproportionate impact from COVID-19. This has been shown across age categories relative to whites. Latinos disproportionately impacted, and others have led to shown that this impact has is going to result more importantly, it's going to impact Hispanic males as well as African American males more relative, and also how context, as we could see, there's large variation. This is COVID-19 mortality by age group. These are ratios relative to whites, and we see early on in the first year that there was a devastating impact, and this has changed somewhat in 2021. And in 2020 and 2021, and the recovery of Latinos, Latino mortality. And this is very important to keep in mind because a significant proportion of mortality that's happening among the Latinx population is deaths under age 65. There are also economic impacts. We know what lockdowns, shelter-in-place mandates, and what have you, and U.S. born Latinos, particularly the foreign-born, have been devastated by this. And also, just moving forward with infections, we have to keep a close eye on long COVID. We know there are a lot of unknowns, and given the high infection rates among the Latino population, we should keep a closer eye on this and the long-term effects. As well as we should also keep an eye on those left behind. We know that there are large impacts for children depending on parental household, and also on the death of parents and also children the reverse way for cognitive status. Although there have been efforts by the government to make that equality does not mean equity, and there are still significant proportions of Latinos across the United States that are being affected by this. There's variation. We know this is going to impact Alzheimer's disease, the state policies and the effects. And when we think about cognition and the different things, it's also important to keep the differences by schools, what these shutdowns are going to do for children. So it's important, I argue, to document cognitive profiles among older adults, but we have to be very careful that in these efforts for health equity, that we do not disenfranchise the groups that we are trying to study. So this is my funding.